June 16, 1961, Cheyenne Mountain just southwest of Colorado Springs. Two U.S. Air Force generals stood at a construction site and simultaneously detonated symbolic charges of dynamite, marking the official start of one of the most ambitious military engineering projects of the entire Cold War. A fully functioning command center built not on a mountain, but inside one, carved directly into nearly 2,000 feet of solid granite. The goal was almost absurdly specific. Engineers needed to build something dense enough, deep enough, and self-sufficient enough to keep functioning normally through the exact scenario it was designed to survive: a direct nuclear strike. Less than 2 decades later, in the middle of the night, the very computer system installed to warn America of that attack would instead convince the country's national security advisor that the attack had already begun, and the mountain built to survive a war would come within minutes of helping start one by accident. Every part of that contradiction had to be engineered by hand, because nothing like it had ever been attempted. There was no existing blueprint for how to blast a self-sustaining underground city out of solid granite, no established playbook for how to keep sensitive electronics running through the exact seismic shock and electromagnetic pulse a nearby nuclear detonation would generate. And there was certainly no precedent for what happens when the warning system built to prevent a nuclear war starts quietly and without anyone intending it, generating the exact data that might have started one. This is the story of how American engineers blasted a self-sufficient city into solid rock, and the technical failure that turned humanity's most fortified bunker into the source of one of the Cold War's most dangerous false alarms.
The urgency behind Cheyenne Mountain traces back to a single Soviet satellite. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, and American defense planners immediately understood the implication. If Moscow could put an object into orbit, it could eventually put a nuclear warhead on an intercontinental missile capable of reaching any American city within minutes, far too fast for existing air defense infrastructure to intercept. The following year, the United States and Canada formally established the North American Aerospace Defense Command, known as NORAD, a joint binational effort to monitor North American airspace and provide warning of exactly this kind of attack. A warning system is only useful if the people and computers running it can survive long enough to actually issue the warning. NORAD's planners needed a command center hardened enough to keep functioning after, or ideally during, a direct nuclear strike, since a command post destroyed in the opening moments of an attack couldn't coordinate any response to what followed. In 1959, planners selected Cheyenne Mountain itself as the site, a triple-peaked mass of pre-Cambrian granite, geologically ancient and extremely dense, close enough to Colorado Springs to be operationally practical, but solid enough to theoretically absorb the thermal radiation and blast overpressure of a hydrogen bomb detonating nearby. The choice reflected a broader shift happening across American nuclear strategy in these years. Earlier Cold War planning had focused heavily on protecting weapons and delivery systems themselves, bombers on runways, missiles in silos. Cheyenne Mountain represented a parallel recognition that the people and computers coordinating a response mattered just as much as the weapons they controlled. A perfectly survivable missile force was of limited value if the command structure meant to authorize and direct its use had already been destroyed in the opening moments of an attack. But what they didn't know was that building inside that granite, rather than simply behind it, would require solving engineering problems that had almost nothing to do with nuclear physics and everything to do with something far more basic. How do you blast a 5-acre underground city out of solid rock without the blasting itself destroying the very stability you're trying to create? The Utah Construction and Mining Company won the excavation contract on May 2, 1961, and crews broke ground just over 2 weeks later. At the formal groundbreaking ceremony on June 16th, Generals Lawrence Cuter and Robert Lee set off the symbolic charges that opened construction. From there, the project's central technical challenge became clear almost immediately. Standard mining blast techniques, designed to break rock apart as efficiently as possible, were exactly the wrong approach for a structure that needed its surrounding granite to remain as structurally intact as possible afterward. To solve this, the Army Corps of Engineers brought in Clifton Livingston, a mining engineer from the Colorado School of Mines, specifically to consult on controlled smooth-wall blasting techniques, precisely calibrated charges designed to fracture and remove rock along carefully planned boundaries, rather than shattering the surrounding granite indiscriminately. Getting that technique right meant the difference between excavating a stable cavern and excavating a structurally compromised one that might collapse under its own stress long before any enemy weapon ever tested it. The real breakthrough came when engineers combined that careful excavation method with an equally unusual structural solution for the buildings that would eventually sit inside the finished caverns. Rather than anchoring the complex's 15 buildings directly to the surrounding granite, which would transmit any shock from a nearby detonation straight into the structures themselves, engineers mounted the entire complex on more than 1,000 massive steel springs. That spring-mounted design let the buildings move independently of the mountain itself during a seismic shock or blast wave, absorbing the kind of sudden, violent motion that would otherwise crack foundations and rupture the sensitive electronics running the entire command center. The steel buildings themselves added a second layer of protection beyond the surrounding rock. Each structure was encased in welded steel plating, creating a Faraday cage-like effect that helped shield the sensitive electronics inside from the electromagnetic pulse a nuclear detonation would generate, a threat separate from the blast and thermal effects the granite itself was already absorbing. Combining deep rock cover, spring-isolated foundations, and steel-shielded buildings meant the complex was engineered to survive 3 entirely different physical threats simultaneously: overpressure, ground shock, and electromagnetic disruption, each requiring its own distinct engineering solution rather than a single blanket fix. Crews eventually excavated roughly 693,000 tons of granite from the mountain, creating chambers up to 100 feet wide and 60 feet high, all sealed at the entrances by blast doors weighing 25 tons apiece, engineered to withstand the overpressure of a multi-megaton nuclear detonation at close range.
However, the biggest challenge was still ahead, because surviving the initial blast was only half the engineering problem. A command center that could take a direct hit but then had to shut down within days for lack of power, water, or air would be almost as useless as one that never survived the attack at all. Engineers designed the complex to operate as a fully self-sufficient underground city, capable of running for weeks with its 25-ton blast doors sealed and zero contact with the outside world. The finished complex included its own power generation plant, more than 6 million gallons of water stored in reservoirs carved directly into the surrounding granite, and roughly 510,000 gallons of diesel fuel to keep generators running through an extended siege scenario. Air filtration systems were built to scrub the incoming air of radioactive fallout particles, letting personnel breathe safely even if the mountain's exterior sat blanketed in contaminated dust. Food storage, sleeping quarters, and even recreational space were built directly into the 15 underground buildings, alongside the command and communications equipment that gave the entire complex its purpose in the first place. Engineering that level of self-sufficiency meant treating the complex less like a single building and more like an entire small town that happened to be located underground. Redundant generators had to be sized not just for normal daily operations, but for the higher electrical demand of running life support systems, water purification, and communications equipment simultaneously for weeks on end without any outside resupply.
Every system had to assume the absolute worst case, that the mountain might need to operate as a fully sealed, self-contained environment for an extended period with zero external contact, and that any single point of failure in power, water, or air handling could eventually compromise every other system depending on it. On April 20, 1966, General Dean Strother, NORAD's commander-in-chief at the time, formally declared the Combat Operations Center operational, even as final construction work continued elsewhere in the complex. The facility reached full completion in February 1967 at a total cost of roughly $142.4 million, a genuinely staggering sum for the era, reflecting just how much specialized engineering had gone into building not simply a bunker, but an entire self-contained city designed to outlast the exact catastrophe it existed to help prevent.
The whole point of surviving inside that mountain was to keep America's early warning systems running, and by the late 1970s, that meant an increasingly complex web of computers processing data from radar stations, satellites, and sensor networks scattered across the continent. In September 1979, NORAD activated a new automated missile warning system inside Cheyenne Mountain, designated 427M, built around two Honeywell 6080 computers, a primary system and a backup, working together to process incoming sensor data and flag any pattern consistent with an actual missile launch. The system had a troubled history even before it went live. Government auditors had flagged it as years behind schedule and significantly over budget, and a 1978 federal report had gone so far as to recommend replacing the entire system outright rather than continuing to patch it. As part of routine operations, the network connecting Cheyenne Mountain's computers to counterpart command centers at Strategic Air Command headquarters, the Pentagon, and other facilities continuously transmitted test messages confirming the line was live, messages that under normal conditions always displayed a missile count of exactly 0. That constant stream of test messages reflected a real engineering necessity. A warning network that only spoke up when it detected an actual attack offered no way to distinguish a genuinely quiet, working system from one that had simply gone dead. Continuous zero-count test messages solved that problem elegantly in theory, confirming every few seconds that the line itself was live and functioning. Nobody building that system in the 1970s had seriously planned for the specific failure mode, where the test message itself, rather than staying silent or going dark, started lying. But this was only the beginning of a design vulnerability nobody had fully appreciated. A system engineered with such enormous redundancy against physical destruction from the outside had never been stress-tested nearly as thoroughly against a much quieter kind of failure happening entirely on the inside.
In the early morning hours of November 9, 1979, a technician at the Cheyenne Mountain Command Post loaded a training tape, a simulated exercise depicting a full-scale Soviet missile attack, into the wrong computer system, one connected to the live missile warning network rather than an isolated training environment. The simulated attack data flowed straight into the real warning displays across the country, and the displays at Cheyenne Mountain indicated an attack by as many as 1,400 ballistic missiles. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski's military assistant, William Odom, woke him near 3 in the morning to report that NORAD was showing 250 Soviet missiles inbound, with the number quickly escalating on subsequent calls to 2,200, a scale of attack that would have represented an all-out nuclear first strike. Brzezinski was reportedly moments away from calling President Carter to recommend an immediate retaliatory response when a final check came through. Independent satellite and ground-based radar systems, entirely separate from the compromised network, were showing nothing unusual at all. Within 6 to 7 minutes of the first alert, the entire episode was confirmed as a false alarm, traced directly back to the misloaded training tape. Strategic Air Command bomber crews who had already begun scrambling toward their aircraft were stood down before any of them left the ground. In the aftermath, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown wrote directly to President Carter, acknowledging that the incident caused him real concern and required corrective action, even as he sought to reassure Allied governments that existing procedural safeguards had prevented the false data from triggering any actual military response. But what they didn't know was that similar false alarms would happen again within months, this time from an entirely different and far stranger cause. On June 3, 1980, Brzezinski received another middle-of-the-night call. NORAD computers were again reporting a massive Soviet missile launch, once more escalating toward numbers in the thousands. Investigators eventually traced this second incident to a single faulty computer chip worth about 46 cents inside a communications device linking Cheyenne Mountain to other command centers. That chip's job was simple: insert a 0 into the missile count field of routine test messages, confirming the line was working normally. Instead, the defective chip was randomly inserting the digit 2 into that same field, turning an all-clear test message into what looked on distant display screens like a report of 220 or 2200 incoming missiles, depending on exactly where in the message the corrupted digit landed. NORAD's own command-in-chief later admitted that the precise failure mode behind the glitch couldn't even be reliably reproduced in follow-up testing, making it that much harder to guarantee it would never happen a third time.
But what they didn't know, in the panic of those two separate nights, was that both incidents would ultimately reshape nuclear command and control engineering as thoroughly as the mountain's granite walls had reshaped fortification engineering 2 decades earlier. In the aftermath, the Pentagon acknowledged that the incidents required serious corrective action, and NORAD's warning architecture was rebuilt around a core principle the original system had never fully embraced. No single computer, however well-engineered, should ever be allowed to trigger a presidential-level nuclear response without independent, physically separate systems confirming the same threat through an entirely different detection method. The real breakthrough came when engineers began treating false positive risk as seriously as they treated the risk of missing a genuine attack, building in mandatory cross-checks between independently sourced data streams before any alert could escalate to the highest levels of government. The 46-cent chip that nearly triggered a catastrophe became, in a strange way, one of the most consequential single components in the entire history of Cold War engineering, precisely because of how cheaply and quietly it very nearly failed. Cheyenne Mountain itself remained NORAD's primary command center for decades afterward, before operations relocated to nearby Peterson Air Force Base in 2006, with the mountain complex retained on warm standby status as a hardened, cyber-attack-resistant fallback. Today, the complex sits under the U.S. Space Force, still capable of assuming full command of North American aerospace defense within minutes if it's ever needed again. A fortress built to survive an attack from outside, which had to learn, the hard way, that the more dangerous failure could come from a single 46-cent part failing quietly on the inside. If you want to see how a different nation built an equally ambitious hardened command bunker of its own, that story is coming to this channel soon. Subscribe if you want to keep uncovering the engineering triumphs and the quiet technical failures hiding inside the Cold War's most fortified places.